Okay.
There she is. What? They should make more dude like notification voices, AI voices.
I don't like them.
No?
Okay. So my problem. Thanks for taking the time. I can't. Let me try to show you. Let me try to show you my problem. Okay, can you see my diagram?
Yeah. There it is. Yeah, got it.
Okay, so the issue I got is that like I got everything works like I wanted it to work. The branching model is definitely good. The performance of the system is pretty reasonable. Like I can do 2,500 requests in like a minute.
Yeah.
There's a lot of tuning that I can do on that. I think I can get to about 10,000 requests in 10 seconds, which is so long as it's significantly more resource consumption than what you could ever do on a single machine. I think that's value in itself, because you can, have that burstability for no real effort. The issue is, how do I correctly integrate the model of user accounts, orgs, the super user, and the anonymous user? And how do I relate those all together so that I can have the applications being consumed in what seems like, I think, 3 different ways that you'd want to consume an app. And the 3 ways are: number 1, you'd want to consume it directly and personally. So you own the repo, you pay the bills of the execution of the repo, you go in and out. You may wish to add other users to that, so grant permission for them to come in and interact with the app. And you may want to say that you will pay their bill, or user pays. So whenever the user tries to enact something, they need to have pre-approved a certain amount of credit that can get burned.
Okay. Wow, it's painful already.
Okay, do you think that's not needed?
No. I actually think it is needed. I think that if you're going for something that's generic enough, like, people are going to be concerned about cost structure immediately, right? Like, not putting an organization model means businesses will never want to adopt it, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then the second of the 3 ways is via an org, where an org is a special case of a user account that's controlled by one or more other user accounts. And that, later we can add features like administration by consensus and different types of ways. But basically, it's an entity that's controlled by other users. The interface is the same, the functions are the same, except the authoritative control is external. It can have a billing arrangement, so it can be responsible for its own bills. It can create and clone and fork other repos within it that it can pay the bills for. And then the third way that you'd want to use apps, I think, are from a store, where the store sort of sits at the top level and it acts as user pays. So you would publish to the store, and then users would consume it, where it's strictly a user pays billing model. But the reason why I think that third means of consumption is needed is because I should be able to make an app that I can consume its services and trust that the data is managed appropriately. Whereas if it's controlled by an org or a user, there's no guarantee about how my usage of that app is being done. Whereas if the store is like a clean hosting environment, like it's like a compliant hosting service, that's where the app runs.
So you have a like, I actually think that you should probably detach the idea of hosting and execution from store for a little bit. I think if I can tell you what I heard now.
Sure.
What I heard is, I think you're missing a thing, basically.
I think that what is the thing?
I think that your repos always have like a control plane on top of them of some sort, right? And that's the thing that the users all get attached to.
What do you mean?
So Colin, so my first thought here was just you have like everything has an organization basically, and like when you're just a singleton user, it's just a singleton organization.
Right.
And then the organization defines, like think of the organization as being like the parent of the users, and like it defines the roles and the access and the pay requirements and stuff like that. And like when a user gets added to that organization, they get added with a role.
Okay.
Now, if you take away the hosting and execution and stuff of the store, it actually kind of felt like almost like the same thing as an org, right? Where the store is basically just defining like a different type of application.
Okay. Yeah, I buy that. So the store is like a special type of org that allows you to attach some applications to it, and they run under the org rules. And if you accept the org rules, then you accept the apps that are running in there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. No, that's good. That's nice and clean.
So the things that are hovering above the repo aren't users, right? The way I would discriminate between like a single, like a user that's just playing around with their own app, or an org that has 500 users, is basically, does that org have one user in it or 500 users?
Why do you want to stack them like that?
I've kind of done it both ways in applications in the past, and what I found is uniformity is almost always like more useful than like less elements in the system, basically. You get what I mean? If you have an org system where you have an org that owns the repo and then users attached to the repo via the org, and then you have a different case where just a user owns the repo directly and there is no org, like now you're doing this conditional switch when you're trying to figure out how things are going to happen between am I in single user mode or am I in org mode, right? Right.
That's a good model. So you want to say everything's an org by default, and users are the singleton case.
Yeah. So every org needs at least one user that is basically the stopgap for all money. Right?
I also want some orgs to have no users. Like you should be able to detach fully from the org and have it be it's now ballistic. Like only the org can make changes to itself now.
Yeah, in which case, like, who's paying for it, basically?
If it was a user pays, or it had its own account that it could manage and do transactions for, then it can be a free floating entity.
Right. So then,
I guess the uniformity that I was trying to shoot for was that everything's a repo, and you can have a billing arrangement. Either any repo can be a billable entity, any repo can relay through, so you can act as the org, or you can act as the user, or you can act as the app, and it sort of proxies for you because it's
Right.
acting as who you've authenticated. You've arranged with it to say that you are now going to go through it. And the whole reason why I did that was, if you see in red, S12345, was I was trying to deal with the fundamental phase change of inside chain land and outside chain land, where those lines were supposed to represent sessions. Sessions represent authenticated client devices that have generated some keys, logged in, proved that they're genuine, and then the only way that actions come into Chainland is via that single channel.
Right.
So instead of letting people like pierce into the system arbitrarily, you always have to pierce into this one. It's like your terminal, like that's your TTY, and you pierce in there, and then from there you relay out to wherever you want to go, which maybe you may relay through your user account, in which case the other resources in the system just see you as the user, or you may relay directly as the session. But I don't think I want to promote that practice, because you should be acting as the user. It's just that the user can see which sessions an activity originated from, but the rest of the ecosystem should only see the user. And where this gets a little complicated, and the reason for my call, is because how when I come in as a session and I come in as a user, and then I go and consume some other repository's resources, that's where it got a little bit, because now I've got all these relays. Because in the rule I was trying to make was that each repo, whenever another repo tries to communicate with it, it sets up this dedicated shared channel, because that's the only way that you can get information between them without sharing a common hash history. So you need to start a new branch that represents the socket between the two repos. That branch has no common history with either of the others, which means that it can be merged into either one without dragging in the whole other repo.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because when you try to push back to a Git service provider like GitHub or GitLab, it won't let you push unless you have all of the objects. You okay? You got to grab that?
No, it's all good. I'm just turning upside down.
Right. So that's the reason, that's the problem I come to you with, is like, it's the communication model between repos that also includes the session model for devices that become authenticated, and then it has to capture when I turn up first with a blank device, I am the anonymous user, and I create a session branch as the anonymous user that then escalates to a specific user, and then that branch needs to come with me.
So that's the case where you want. Hold on, I'm not actually sure I'm following. I think so. The things that are going between the repos, like they're kind of they're tagged as belonging to the repo or to the user that owns that repo.
they're only tagged as the repo. Like you can only see if you're an app repo, like say you're a CRM, and you get an incoming channel, you can only see the repo that sent it in. Now that repo might be a user, it might be an org, it might be another app, but it's not. It's purposely masked from you. You shouldn't be able to see deeper into it unless that repository opened up and let you see what's going on. If you had read access to it, then you can trace, where did the origination, where was the origin action.
Okay.
But I try to make the rule that unless that repo opens up to you, you only see, you think it is the originator.
Right.
Because there should be no difference between an application consuming a service versus a user or an org consuming a service. It should all look the same.
Yeah, I get you. And the other thing too is users and orgs are also repos, right?
That was the point. That was the uniformity that I was striving for, is that they all are all repos, and it's sort of no business which one they are.
Okay. So that's a different design goal than what I was saying. I think,
I take your point though. Like I like what you say, that uniformity is worth it's sacrificing element count for. I agree with that. It's just the conundrum I have is there's this conduit that comes from the outside, which is the authenticated device streaming in to the repo, and then I was, for unknown reasons, I felt very attached to making that conduit at least be similar in kind to the conduit between repos, so that the programming model stays the same.
No, I think that's the right call completely. I guess another thought experiment for this kind of problem always is, are you missing other repos like other than user and so one thing I think that might be an interesting experiment for you to do is to if you wanted to follow that vein of like everything has an organization, everything has that kind of authenticating layer or like role providing layer, I guess is the way I would think of it, is like do you get farther by not calling it an organization? Like is there some other name for it that makes it like fit a slightly different role that like helps promote that uniformity? But I think I can also see the case for not for having org being a fundamentally distinct thing from user from anonymous user.
I think now that you poke at that, part of the problem I had was I was also considering the database design for it as well. Like how do I track, like I didn't want to deal with Git submodules. I wanted to.
No one ever does.
No, right? And so this relationship between one repo owning another one, at some point there's a top level thing, and I kind of wanted to have my database strated by users, because the user is the one with the credit card, or the org. Whoever has the credit card was what I wanted to be like. That's the thing I care about, and I want to cut the whole system up like that. Who's paying as the demo?
Well, I think an org would be a very fine candidate for being the credit card carrier, because that gives you your goal of like ballistic. You leave the credit card attached to it, but none of the users. I think you could even make a strong case that like there is no user. There's just user objects inside the org. Like if the org is a repo.
Yeah, but then the org, the user is what I was using to do the OAuth loop with GitHub.
Yeah.
So the OAuth keys, the OAuth tokens need to be stored in some repo somewhere.
And you want them to be private. You want them to not leak.
Yeah, and you want them to, like I was storing them as a .env file in the repo that was get ignored, like hard coded, get ignored. So even if you deleted your git ignore, your env file is not coming with you. Like,
right. Okay, I can. I think there's a philosophical argument you could make that, like, in a system like this, like, I guess actually, hold on, let me just back up, because I think that you want users to be like as concrete as possible in this ecosystem, right? I think there's
but it's like what are they? I think they are a GitHub account at the minimum.
Which is where I was trying to go with that, is like a user, the way it exists on the internet right now, is really just a claim that like some consistent set of hardware and some consistently self-identifying thing like has repeatedly attempted to communicate with this organization, right?
Right.
Like when I log in via GitHub, I'm basically poking them with the same secrets that I poked them with last time, to a sufficient degree that they think that I'm the same entity over and over again, right?
Right.
So like, does my identity exist independently of GitHub, the organization? Now, I'd want them to, right? Because I think the idea of a fully decentralized, fully realized, concrete, static entity that represents me as a person inside of a compute system is something that I think everyone is shooting for, right?
Yeah, but
that's independent of any organization.
First, yeah, we can't have that first. So I was just modeling GitHub as this magically, these are users. This is a person. Right. Like, if you got it, that for now, that's all I care about. Sort of my goal was that the user has to be a repo, because I want the user to be able to export all of their data. Like, I don't want to fall into the tempting trap of doing some accounting database side that the user can't get at and pull out. That's sort of why you can tell me that maybe I need to relax that constraint a little, maybe.
No, I think that needs to be that's a very ambitious and very like socially responsible goal.
Right. Thank you. And I think that if you start with that, you're stuck with it. But if you don't start with that, it gets harder and harder to do that later.
Yeah. And like, especially once like the money interests start pouring into the system, right?
Yeah. Like, if the user, so the only restriction that I'm putting on a user right now is that the repo has consistency constraints. So while it is being executed within our hosting service, it will follow these strict rules, which means that it will only run code from these isolates. It will only allow these actions, and some of these actions have a constraint on them that means your account needs to be in good standing for us to do this thing on your behalf that you asked. But at any point, you can clone that repo down. You can push it up to GitHub. It's yours. We just operate it for you, so long as you're paying us. That's the contract.
Right.
And some of these repos can be big, right? Like the CRM is, it's 10,000 customer records at a start, but it's a full-blown repo. You can pull that down. That use case is 10 different staff members plus a public-facing website that can modify portions of that repo based on people, entering credit card information and changing their schedules and things like that. So it's like, that's why, where does this entity sit and who can access it and how, and who's paying the bill? That's the soup. So
I'll ask you this, like, obviously there's more than one user connected to Repo 2 here, right?
Yes.
Is the money, like the credit card that you've associated with the user, is that only paying for their interactions with the repo? is there a credit card like associated with just the repo as well? And what happens when you attach an
Uh,
org to it?
I didn't want to attach repo credit cards to repos. I only wanted to attach credit cards to users and to orgs.
Right.
Um,
And those are
because-
basically things that define the boundary of the system, then, right?
Yeah, that's outside. Outside is beyond that.
Okay.
Um, And so, like a fully detached repo, like one that is free floating in space and has no owner, effectively becomes the property of the super. Just like
Right.
when you spawn a process as a child process in a Unix system, if you free that child, like you relinquish your parental relationship to the spawned process, it becomes a child of the root process. It becomes a direct child of the kernel. And so
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. But the credit cards, I don't think that like I think a daemonized process should be able to hold credits. It just can't hold a credit card.
Right. The money is entirely on the outside world, right? You only ever see real money moving at the boundary.
Yeah, but you should be able to do interactions within the system that result in real money that you can withdraw out of the boundaries of the system.
Yeah.
So, like, you could set up a daemonized process that earned you money, and then you withdraw that money into the outside world because it's transferring a portion of that to you every interaction, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm actually more convinced now that user and org are different things, and that there isn't always an org on every repo.
Okay. One of the constraints I'd set here, and I made up these constraints and I made this mess. So you can tell me that my constraint is invalid or needs changing. But the distinction of what a user is it is a repo that can accept external sessions.
Okay.
So an
Yeah.
org can't have a session.
I think that's correct because devices belong to. No, that's not true. Devices can belong to orgs, but I guess sessions can't. Sessions always involve some sort of a authorization check or like some sort of identity check, right?
Yeah, right. And so, I could model an external system, like I could model, I don't know, OpenAI servers, if they wanted to cooperate and push into the system, they would be modeled as a user with a session. Maybe.
Let me think that one through for a second. So I don't necessarily like the name user because I think that there's probably more. I actually think it makes sense to try to stick to the idea that, humans are humans and machines are machines. Maybe not. I don't know.
I don't think there should be a distinction between a human and a machine. There's really just a distinction between do you have a credit card or not. Cool. Right. Call me an asshole. But that's a good point you raised, though, that in the CRM system, I need to have a local agent running on premise that has a connection to the accounting system that runs on site that then needs to channel that back up. And so that device should be modeled in the system as what? A user, because it has a session?
Let me ask you this question: S1, 2, 3, 4. Like, what are you what do you perceive those things to be, right?
At the
They don't
moment,
have circles around them.
The browser tab, yeah, because they're
They're
not
not actually
they're
repos,
not
right?
things. They're the external excitation of the system. And so I was imagining them being browser tabs for now.
Right.
And
But
so they've
in all
got through
reality,
the authentication process.
they could be anything. They could be just single actions too, right?
Any external excitation can be one of those things. So long as they can speak the protocol and they can pass the
Mhm.
authentication challenges, then that's a session. Session's open.
Yeah. So, and the reason they're all fanning into the user is because that's the thing that's providing the
The
authentication check,
user,
basically.
they represent the user. And so everything they do within the ecosystem thinks it's that user, but the user is controlling its behavior using a plethora of devices, which is that's how people be. Right?
Yeah,
You know, like
for sure.
you come at it from your phone, from your laptop, from your fucking whatever. Like you're coming at it from all over the place.
So,
It seems
you know,
wrong.
go ahead.
It seems that it should be a special case of entity within the system that can communicate outside of the system.
But you've allowed everything to be pierced, right?
No.
No?
No. I wanted to keep piercing at the edges because if you allow any entity to be pierced from the outside,
Right.
then you can't ever trace back. Like if you want to snip, say, user 123 browser tab 579, and you want to snip it because it's been compromised, if you've allowed the piercing to come in like raindrops, you know, how do you send a signal to the whole system to say snip?
You got to run the whole system on one machine, and then it has one button.
Right. Yeah, which is like the wrong button. So, so by forcing it to all come in through a single entity, and then forcing that entity to have relationships with the other entities, you can snip any one of those things, and it's instant cut.
Right. So what you're really proposing is like basically there's a super class of user that's like a pierceable thing, basically, right? It has has the ability on the outside to upgrade external excitation into an authenticated thing that is now, you know, this thing is providing it credibility as it like launches it into the rest of the system, basically.
Yeah, and that was a fundamental thing from 2019, right? Because if you try and have actions as something with a signature and all that, and it can drop in anywhere, that's really bad. It's tempting, but it's really bad.
Right. And you don't really need actions internally in the system because everything's sharing state with everything else. So you need data everywhere else. It's not so calling something an action or what?
It's still actions because I'm still like relaying. So like you know, the browser will generate the excitation. It will come in to the user. The user will pass it straight through, but it will rebadge it as the user, and then that goes out into the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I actually really agree with that design decision. I just wonder if maybe the word user is like dragging down the understanding a little. Like what it's like what it's really doing is it's like accepting messages that pass the authentication protocol and rejecting ones that don't. Right.
It's like a phase change. It's like the edge of the system is defined by this gateway in and out.
The gateway. That's a really good name for it.
Gateway. So
then is there any
a gateway entity is that which is pierceable.
Right. And then every gateway could have, I mean, like, let's just think of it like this. Is there such a thing as a gateway with more than one user attached to it? And then how would you model that?
Okay, so each session right now is being modeled as a branch. So entities, these repos, have arbitrarily many branches which represent computation or activity of some kind.
Yep.
A piercing stream is just another branch. So within that model, any repo could be pierced. But sorry, what was your question again?
I'm actually kind of not sure it's a good question. I think like on the outside of this thing, you're basically providing some sort of authentication protocol. What I'm asking is, is it necessarily the case then that like upgrading those messages coming in from sessions or upgrading the sessions from anonymous to like authenticated, like does that necessarily imply that there is exactly one person or machine doing that basically?
There's one set of private keys per session. That was how the design is supposed to be.
Yeah. But I mean, because there's two things going on this user, right? You have a fan in of all this like external excitation on the system.
Yep.
And then you have a fan out to all the other applications that are associated with this user, right?
Right. That's right.
So, well, I think it makes a lot of sense, like conceptually, to say, like, at least to explain the model to people when you say that these users are allowed to access these apps, right? That's the fan out part.
That's the fan out part, yeah. And you can give permissions should be based on that gateway, like a gateway that has passed the authentication properties from this network-wide authenticity service, aka the Artifact GitHub Authenticator. We endow this gateway with the relationship user XYZ on GitHub.
Right. So yeah, I guess it's what I'm kind of trying to say is strip out the $sign part from the user node here. Like I'm wondering if it helps you to just cut the node in half vertically. So like there's obviously the fan in part is one thing and the fan out part is another. The fan out part is very easy to describe as a user. Like it's very easy to explain to people, this is what users do. Users like use certain apps and they like want access to certain apps. And that's what you're doing with the blue lines there, right?
Sorry, and you want me to cut the user?
Just draw a line through it vertically. It is the same thing. Sorry. Like there's a top and a bottom here. Sorry, no, you were right. Horizontally. The line is horizontal, the division is vertical.
We can say that this is outside.
That's the boundary of the system now. Now, what I'll contend to you here is the thing on the bottom, it makes a lot of sense to describe as a user.
So down the bottom here, you think that you could call that entity a user? Yeah.
And then the top is something that's more like a gateway, right? But I'm just wondering, are those two things the same thing? Like, is that the thing that's confusing? Because you have these two fundamentally different activities that are going on here, right? You're saying I'm transforming messages on the network in the outside world into like things that I as a user say on the inside world, if that makes sense.
And so is that correct? To say that org doesn't have that collector piece?
Yeah, I mean, and if you think about it, that just means that it's actually inside the system. It doesn't have
it's purely
a reason
inside.
To be on the boundary. It doesn't have a reason to be on the boundary, right?
Right. But then, okay, and then if I also have something in here that's trying to do a side effect out, how does that fit this model?
Right. So that thing needs to be on the outside-inside boundary, right? And what it needs to do is continuously probe the hardware that it's connecting to for authentication status.
So that would be when it's actually driving out. So it's the excitation originates within Chainland,
right.
And it
but
pushes
it needs to
out.
Right. But if you think about that, like your whole request response thing. Like, I think what you do when you're talking to hardware in the outside world is you wait for it to come back to you and say, okay, re-authenticate me, I'm listening. So it's still an inbound request. It's an inbound request to wait to get the next message from inside the system.
I don't understand. What do you mean?
No?
Yeah.
Draw it on the out and in boundary. Like, what I'm trying to show you is that, yeah. So what I'm trying to say is there's, again, this side effect thing has the same property where it has a name inside the system, right? That's really what you're saying with user is, like, I've decided to take all this stuff that's scanning into me. Yeah. And I've decided to give it a name that's semantically meaning, yeah, that's the side effect.
Okay.
But if you think of what the side effect is almost always doing, is there's some sort of system sitting out there that like needs to maintain this connection on that boundary between the inside world and the outside world, right?
Yep.
It actually behaves in a very, very similar way to the sessions, where like it needs to upgrade its messages. Well, it could be a session though. It could be the same thing. You can, when you plug it in and you turn it on, it needs to like ask very first as an anonymous object, can I go through this authentication protocol? And then at that point,
from out of band, it needs to have gotten some information about how it is supposed to connect to,
which makes it a session basically, right?
Oh god, yeah, it does. Okay, so the accounting system would be like, okay, here's the URL. Hit the URL. Okay, I am accounting system XYZ, and I want to connect to CRM ABC. Challenge me, and it's like, the system comes back and goes, you need to prove these keys, and it's like, here you go, sign, ding, and then its session gets moved from the anonymous entity to this other pierced entity.
Yeah, like another full-blown named object in the internal universe in the system, right?
Okay, this is making more sense now. Okay.
That I'm now allowed to send things to that by name, and it'll always go back to the underlying external hardware device.
Inside the system, I am represented as this.
Yep.
So that the external hardware is represented as the internal piece.
Yep. Yeah. So you're
all right. So what that means then is that any entity in the system, if the system gives it permission to, should be allowed to PS in and PS out through that boundary. And so really, the special thing about users is not that. The PS ability is not the special thing about a user.
It's still special. It's just, it's not a, actually, I kind of disagree. I think that like, if you want to write this in the safest way possible, you have two different types of nodes in the network diagram here, right? You have nodes that are not possible to ever pierce, like the way they run has no pierceability to them. And then you have nodes that are possible to pierce.
So like an org. And so whether something can be pierced or not is a configurable item within the repo. An org would be a repo that is permanently configured to never be pierceable because it is a pure chainland entity. Does that?
I think so. Like, do you think there's a need to have some sort of authentication mechanisms for an org?
Any reason for an org? Like an org it's like a folder structure. It only holds things. It never does things.
Yeah, it just grants users with roles basically, and the roles might be meaningful anywhere else in the system.
Right. It's like what it does is it takes all this stuff and then just moves it over to be attached to the org. So
the other way you could do org is like when you get a certificate, you always have a third party verifier. So like the org has a list of rules about which users have what roles. If you ever need to do any sort of extra checking on a user, and you don't want to contain all that like permission information inside the application repo, you might want to ask an org repo if this user is allowed to do that thing. Like an org is a container that basically describes the relationships between users and apps, and I see why it's kind of confusing, like that it's not on the outside. It's not the same type of thing as a user, but it has no need to talk to the outside world, right? What it might one way you could draw it is basically it's like a barrier between the blue stuff and the user.
Yes. It's
another way you might want to use an org is like just like when things are coming in, you go and check with the org that this is who they say they are. It's sort of like a cert check, right?
Right.
Or this person is allowed to.
Here's another way to look at it, is that orgs can be members of orgs. So
I think that's fine.
reasonable, right? Right. So
Yeah.
if an org is basically the embodiment of arbitrarily many I'm losing sight of what's special about a user then.
I don't think there is much that's special about a user. I mean, I think that what you just did with side effects there, like a user is a side effect to the system. It has like a semantic meaning in relation to everything else because it has an internal name, but it's just allowed to let outside stuff into the system.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. All right. That's I think that's the fundamental problem I had then. I was thinking users were special.
I think just for the sake of completeness of the diagram, the way I actually think I would draw org is literally as like user talks to org and then org fans out to everything else. Org, if it exists, is
user.
like
So user never talks to anything.
That's not true. User can talk to the things that it can talk to directly, but it might talk to some things via an org, and it might talk to some things directly.
Right. So I could say that a user was a pierced org.
A user is a pierced org. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, not quite, because users don't have that downstream kind of relationship with each other, right? Like you can't have a user be the block of another user, can you?
I think you can. You should be able to manage arbitrarily many identities within the system. Like as a user, I make more user entities, and it's really the fact that it can be externally accessed is the only discriminator between is it an org or is it a user.
Maybe what I wonder is, does a user ever talk directly to another user, not via an app?
I hadn't planned that, and I don't like that because it means that I have to manage that functionality. I would prefer that they talked using an app.
Right. So org is an app that allows user to talk to another user, basically.
No, an org is an app that emulates a user. It's like a proxy for a user. It allows many users to act as one user.
Yeah, okay. I guess the org doesn't have no attachment to the outside world either, because it can be creditable, right?
You mean like it can have a credit card?
Yes.
I think that if I made the restriction that only users can have credit cards, then you can sort of pass on you can take on the org's bills, but ultimately the credit card should be held with a person because I don't know.
Yeah. So, okay. I think if a user can't talk to another user except via an app, then I think that the user has a property here that like you could never have a user block some applications like an org would block some. Org is basically another fan in level for users that fans out to repos, right?
Right, correct.
But like
Yes,
you could never use a user to be a fan in level for other users because that would require the
yes,
users to talk directly to the users.
I think that yes, you can talk, but the only talking you can do is a relay. Like you can't talk as in
I can't write your state. Only you can write your state as a user, right?
yeah, like I have, and that state pertains to how I can be pierced. Like, how do I make connections to the outside world is the only special state that a user entity holds. But the Chainland interface shouldn't be any different to any other repo. Like all entities in the system should look identical when they're talking to each other. You shouldn't know that you're talking to a user or an app or anything.
Right. So one of those blue lines on the fan outside of the user node there could be another user on the boundary somewhere else with its own sessions.
Yes, I think that's a legitimate thing.
But like I would talk to another user as if it's an application, but like what would that other user do with that message?
They can only relay it on. So I would have a destination for it. I'd be like, hey, go and access this forbidden site for me, and then tell me what you got back. And
so users is relaying like something that's native to every single node in the diagram?
Relaying is an enabled feature.
Right.
It's not it doesn't do it by default. It's a feature that needs to be enabled, just like piercing or side effecting.
Right, because relaying, if I understand what you're saying, is basically I'm going to send you a message and then it's proxying and you're going to send it as if you were the originator.
That's right. That's right. Like a NAT.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'd be really conscious of the idea that if you're going to connect that user to another user as an application level, like in Chainland item, like it's probably going to suggest to people that there's all these other uses for it too, right? Like you'll have to justify why it's only allowed to do that relay, like why that specific lockdownness basically of this thing that for all other reasons should.
It seemed like having the, how in companies you have this concept of an ultimate beneficial owner, so that you can have like shells of shells of shells of shells, but ultimately it's this thing, right? So the concept of like, what is the base user or the base actor that is requesting from me in this system seemed useful for the purposes of like, so if I'm in the CRM and I get a request and I'm like, is this, first of all, who is the user that just made this request? And second of all, are they allowed has the owner of the system allowed this user? So there is this concept of like allowed entities. And I guess you would have, it'd be like if you allowed API access into a system, you're allowing this app to come in or this user to come in, and the distinction doesn't need to be hard, like this or that or whatever, but I need some way for the recipient to determine something about the originator or the sender.
Right. So here's another way of asking the question I was just trying to ask is if I were to just embed another blue node in here that's an application node that has absolutely no upgradability, has no outside world connectivity, and like make it act like a user.
Right.
and then proxy all the messages through that.
Right.
Like, is that the same thing as like another user that I'm connecting directly to that's on the surface that actually has sessions? Like with respect to the rest of the system,
It's yeah, you're right. It would be exactly the same. And I think the way I can remodel this to get around the first use case I described of authentication is that there's some system provided services. Like over here is the GitHub Authenticator, and so the CRM would ask the GitHub repo, "Hey, is this repo that just tried to access me? First of all, is it a user? Yes or no that you know about? Second of all,
Right.
what's the authenticated username?" And then it checks that, and so you can make as many proxy users as you want in the system, but only some of them would have authenticated with this authentication service in Chainland so that the CRM can check with it.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. So if I were to somehow be able to send actions through the GitHub Authenticator, my users could be fully inside Chainland and just proxies, basically.
That's right.
Or the GitHub Authenticator could spit out another boundary object, a user, that has the token stored in the memory. So every time you open a browser tab, the session attaches to that user.
Yeah.
Like,
So I think what my folly was that I wasn't modeling the GitHub authentication service inside Chainland. I was
Right.
treating it external to the system as a whole, and that's where the confusion came from. But if I model it as it's a service within the network, and
it's
that
a side effect, right?
it's a side effect, yeah. And so a user would come in and it would go to the GitHub service and say, "Hey, I want to prove that I'm user XYZ." And it's like, okay, here's an OAuth loop, come back. And then it goes through, and then it's like, it sort of gives you a badge to that entity and says, you are now able to act within Chainland as this GitHub user for this validity period. And
in other words, it spits out the user as a child chain, basically, beside it, right? Like the user object you have drawn here.
it would give you a signed token that you could then present to, like, hang on, let me try to draw it. If this is the CRM over here,
Yeah.
then when a user comes in, it would make a request out to the GitHub service to be like, "Do you know about this guy?" And it would get the result back like that, right?
Yeah.
And that's what authenticated means in the system, which means that we can enable different types of providers like Google or Facebook or Apple.
No. I mean,
And that's how they're modeled in the system, as they're right. And then where that goes ultimately is that. Sorry.
Can I pause you? Can I try and like say what I was trying to say one more time here? I think like when A2 sends the request to GitHub, sure, it gets a token, and what the token does is it basically says, if I get traffic from the user node, like then it's allowed to do things on A2, right? But I'm trying to.
But carry on.
Okay. Because the user is basically the bearer of the token, right?
No. That token interaction occurs whilst the user is interacting with the GitHub service to prove that the external GitHub user has sanctioned this user in Chainland to be represented by this external GitHub user. Right.
So user here pre-exists everything, basically. Like it has the same existence as the GitHub thing, and probably the applications. Like what I'm trying to get at is like, how do I figure out like what blue lines are allowed for the user, and when do those get created? When do those?
All right. Yeah. Okay. So I can answer that. Can I? insert one more piece of information that can help expand the generality of what this authentication service is. So if I have over here, this is another type of authentication service called KYC.
Yeah.
And how you pass that is, as a user, you would interact with the KYC service.
Yeah.
And you'd go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until ultimately the KYC service said, yep, you're legit. Then when I want to go do something, let's say that A2 is a casino.
Yeah.
The user says, I want to gamble.
Yeah.
And then A2 says, hey, KYC service, I just got a request from this user. Are they over 18? Hopefully that doesn't do something stupid like just deletes the old stream. Yeah, so that's what I think it should be remodeled as.
It's interesting because, like, the way you've pitched them, KYC and GitHub, they feel like orgs now, right? Like they feel like they're collections of users, but they're services, yeah.
And all they do is they just allow anyone in the ecosystem to check if this repository has this badge or not.
Right. So the question I have is when does user get created? When does the user node get created?
At the
Basically,
moment,
as soon as you start running the software?
As soon as you connect to the system and say that you want to be a user. So you say that you are no longer the anonymous user and you want to be a distinct user, that's when the user gets created in the system.
And so, like, is there any external authority involved in that, or is that, how do you do that upgrade?
Right now, you would go through the OAuth process with GitHub.
Right.
And then that would allow me to get your session back when you come in from a new browser. I'm like, oh yeah, I know who you are now.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I just need to make a note. Like, you just helped me see one of the mistakes I made. Because I had tried to prefix all the data associated with a repository in the system. I tried to prefix it with a unique ID that I generated for the user. And I can see now from our discussion that that's pointless. There should only be a unique ID generated for each repo. And then the relationships between those repos are maintained at the repo level, not at the user level. So that's greatly simplifies things for me.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, that was a problem because I'd sort of ended up with this model of like, when you have GitHub and you have like accounts and repositories, I need this system to look like how your computer looks, because on your computer you pull down different repos from all these different accounts and repositories, and so you have like a third field in your identifier, which is my computer / account name / repository name. And so that's what Artifact is. And it was always a problem to me. What's that first ID for my computer? But I think after talking to you now, I generate that for every repo. Every repo is unique and free floating. And then they have this ownership relationship is modeled in chain land, not in database land.
Right.
And then authentication I had embedded the GitHub OAuth too deeply. I had embedded it at the database level, whereas it should be modeled as just a service in the system.
Yeah.
That, anyone can start any service, and it's really up to the app itself what it wants to believe or trust.
Right. So, I know it seems like I'm harping on this, but I think as defined right now, the user node, like the life cycle of it, is underneath of the life cycle of your authentication service provider. And you'd want it to exist outside of that somehow. But the problem is that the sessions that you're using on the user are only allowed to be used there because of the authentication service provider, right?
No, so I could make another one that was like here. That was just the it's like public key infrastructure style, where it's just like if you generate keys and push them into this service, then you are a user, and if you lose those keys, you're screwed. I can't help you.
Right.
But that's another type of user authentication, and then it's really up to the app what it wants to accept as suitable proof of user.
Right, which is what you were trying to say with KYC. I'm sorry, you were trying to explain that to me all along. User definitely has its own life cycle. It just the sessions would be, they'd have whatever properties they have from the auth system that you're using. You could have as many of them as you want from different auth systems, right?
Right.
And that's how you make that's how you make the user more resilient than basically belonging to an auth system.
Yeah. So I think that obviously the first entity that gets created is the super user, because otherwise I can't do anything to the system. And then secondly, I would make the anonymous user chain, of which whenever you first come there, you're just opening a session with the anonymous chain, and then you use that to interact with the system to convince an auth provider that you're now this new entity, and then you're off.
Is anon everybody uses the same anon?
Yeah, isn't it?
Okay. No. I mean, that's how I do it in a database for sure. There's anonymous is just some. It's like the null pointer in userland, right?
It's a special case. Yeah, it's it doesn't have to exist, but without it, you don't get a login prompt.
I just wonder if there's another way you could do it where you create anons on the fly that are just one-to-one to sessions.
You mean you start as a PKI user where you just generated some keys and you...
Yeah, that's another way to do it. If you're willing to provide the infrastructure right off the bat, is just throw away keys, right? But that way you always have inputs to the system. There's a problem when you start to max everybody's inputs in one single anonymous node, is that you've now allowed some people to mask themselves by, you've now allowed some people to mask themselves by looking like everybody else, basically, right?
Oh, no. So the idea was when you come into the Anon chain, mm-hmm. you have to generate a unique public key.
Right.
That's the only way you're allowed to communicate with the Anon chain, is you must generate a public key.
Right. Okay. So then you can still distinguish people from each other.
Yeah. And I mean, further than that, I was just going to browser fingerprint people when they came in so that I could sort of group them together as well. Anyway.
This is fun. I miss drawing diagrams. I'm really tired of people that code by just sitting there and grinding in a code editor.
Oh God, I hate those people. Oh man, this helped out a lot. So I can see where my errors are and where I need to re-architect. But it's not much. I just really wanted to get it right because otherwise I just felt like I was sort of baking stuff in that I wasn't sure about, and it, you know, it had some sneaky smells here and there, but I was like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I find it's always really, really useful when you're dealing with auth to like draw that line, the in and out line, like to be really, really clear about like what's in the boundary and what's out of the boundary.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think I see enough to get unstuck for now. Have you got a few more minutes and I'll tell you about some of the some of the problems that are no longer problems?
Sure.
Okay, so I managed to make a bottleneck-free version of Git that runs that's backed by a really big KV store. Because as it turns out, there was a bottleneck in Git where the index file is a problem. The index file contains last modified information about every file in the repository. And so as your repository size grows, the index file grows, and so too does patching it. So I've removed the index file completely. And so now
what was it used for? It's just recency information?
Change detection.
Oh.
It's like, well, you know, this file system, this file on the file system is different to what's in the index. Therefore, we need to scan it and do a diff comparison in order to provide what comes next, right?
And so how did you do the same thing? Like, you still need to do that, don't you?
No. Because what happens is the index Git was designed for a single file system, and the idea was that the index stays with the file system, and so when you check out, it makes a new index and all these other things. And so the way I'm doing it now is there is no working directory, there is no index. When you try to read a file, you're always reading it at a specific commit, and then it does the tree walk to get you the file or tell you it doesn't exist. And then when you within the same execution boundary, so in between one commit to the other, if you write the file, I cache it. And so it had the interesting system signature now is that writes are fully synchronous and instant, but reads are always asynchronous. So whenever you write a file, it's just like instantaneous, and then reading it can be several hops because it's got to get the hash of the directory tree, look up that thing, get the next hash, look up that. So reading's kind of slow, but writing is quick.
Right. You can probably do some sort of like, well, there's ways you can optimize that too, I'm pretty sure, right? If you just use like a more keys in a memo or something like that to do, like to speed the lookup.
Yeah, so you mean there might be a way to transform the file system into a more efficient, like flatten it.
Yeah.
And so
no, what I mean is like if you're going to do hop, like, and there's like, and it's deterministic from where you start. I guess things might change. Like what I'm saying is if you enter like back and then like you have to hop 5 times and get the thing now, then if you cache the thing that you got now from your entry point, like keyed on the entry point, then like you don't have to do those hops again later. But
it's everything's always cached. So whenever it does a lookup, it will store it. But I think what you're saying is that like if I have a path that's 5 directories deep, I'm going to be hobbled because my lookups are always 5 steps. But if I transform the file system to flatten it a bit, then I can sort of give the user the same thing, but with much more efficient lookups.
Yeah, that's right. I guess you just don't do hops. Save the hops by not doing them, right?
Yeah, but then there's the other problem is that you have to have some level of hops because if you get a large number of files within the system, a directory with 10,000 files takes about 5 to 6 seconds to update one file in that directory. And so you do need some level of sharding it in terms of directories, which turns out is what Git does in its internal structure anyway. It shards based on the first 2 characters of the hash of the object. So it ends up with a maximum of 256 folders within the object store. But from looking around at the benchmarks, it seems like for most use cases, that's enough. So by default, it shards. And I think we may need to do something similar for large numbers of files. But I think the point you raise is interesting because we could actually make that transparent to the user. And only if you start to dig into the directory structure itself, like you clone the repo and look at it on your machine, then you'll realize that the file system you thought you were using isn't. It's emulated.
Right.
But all the data is still there. And if you use the tools, you can parse it. But it can actually be a lot faster for a lot of things if I do that transform, I think.
I think I did that once when I had an iPod, a Generation 1 iPod, and I just pulled all the files off of it. I pulled all the files off of it on a non-Mac machine, and all the folders were just gobbledygook. They were just hexadecimal,
Right.
and that's what it was. It was a hash, like a hexadecimal content addressing system, where they broke the hex strings into substrings and made them into folders. So you're triggering a memory in me right now.
Yeah, but so it works really well. And one of the most beautiful things about the Deno KB store that I've found is that you can do these atomic operations that are faster than doing a series of non-atomic ones, because it envelopes up all the mutations you want and then ships the whole lot over to the database and then executes them. And then if the checks you provided pass, then it's like, yep, done. And so it comes out a lot faster. But the cool feature they have is that you can atomically enqueue things into the big ass queue that they've got. So only if all your writes succeed, then queue up the message for further processing that has guaranteed at least once delivery. So it's pretty sweet. I think it's got some good liveliness guarantees. Like, it should be hard to stall the system.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, but yeah, it's a beautiful thing they've provided there.
I can barely wrap my head around it. Customizable consistency. I'm on the page right now.
Yeah. So like, it's a KB store with strong consistency guarantees that can be weakened if you want, but you can also do atomic operations on the KB store, which is fabulous. So anyway, I've managed to get that working in the cloud. Works pretty good. It's fast enough. Once I can get this user model implemented, then it's like open.
Nice. And you're just gonna flood it with so much data, see what it's made out of, eh?
Yeah, so far seems pretty good, man. Like, you can burn a lot of money in a very short amount of time, is what I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I should get back to work, I guess.
For sure. It's good chatting.
Thank you very much. That helped out a lot.
Yeah. Anytime.
Yeah. Was there any other topics you wanted to bring up or cover or anything like that? Or?
No, I don't think so. I should
Nope,
just
okay.
get back to my elite codes.
Okay. Sweet. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll
Yeah.
keep you posted.
Yeah. See you, man.
Yep.
Bye.